There is a play that happened on June 9, 2026 in Berea, Ohio that the national media barely covered, that most NFL fans never saw, and that defensive coordinators across this entire league should be losing sleep over right now. It wasn't in a game, it wasn't in the playoffs, it wasn't even in the preseason. It happened at a mandatory minicamp in front of a handful of reporters on a Tuesday afternoon, when a quarterback wearing number 2 dropped back, went through his progression, identified a corner giving a soft cushion on the outside, and launched a football 60 yards through the air that landed perfectly in the hands of a wide receiver running at full speed down the sideline. The Cleveland Browns head coach, Monken, stopped practice, not to correct a mistake, not to diagram a better route. He stopped practice because what he had just witnessed was so clean, so precise, and so effortless that it demanded acknowledgement in real time. Reporters covering those 3 days of mandatory minicamp were asked afterward what the single most memorable moment of the entire session was. Not a Watson completion, not a Gabriel rep, not a team drill. The throw of the day, they said, a 60-yard deep ball from Shedeur Sanders to Isaiah Bond, number 0, a wide receiver who was completely ignored by the entire NFL draft just 14 months ago. And here is what makes that play so much more important than just a highlight from a practice nobody televised. Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback who threw that ball, walked up to reporters after practice and said something that quarterbacks almost never say publicly in this league. He said he wants to use Isaiah Bond more. He said he enjoys playing with him. He said the deep game is a major strength of Bond's and that it's a connection he wants to keep developing. In an NFL locker room, that is not a normal statement. Quarterbacks spread credit around. They talk about everyone contributing. They say the whole unit is improving and that opportunities will be there for everybody. That is the safe answer. That is the professional answer. Shedeur Sanders did not give the safe answer. He named Isaiah Bond specifically. He told every defensive coordinator in this league exactly where he intends to go with the football. He put a target on Bond's back in the best possible way, and in doing so, he confirmed something that this channel has been tracking since November of last year. This connection is real, it is growing, and the NFL is absolutely not prepared for what is coming on July 28th when training camp opens in Berea. But before we get into what this pairing is going to do to defenses in 2026, before we break down the offensive infrastructure that makes this connection genuinely terrifying, and before we talk about what happened at minicamp in full detail, you need to understand the backstory of Isaiah Bond. Because the majority of people watching this video know Shedeur Sanders' story inside and out. They know the 5th round, they know the draft slide, they know the quarterback competition, they know every detail of what happened between April and November of 2025. But Isaiah Bond's journey to Berea is nearly as dramatic as anything Shedeur went through, and you cannot fully understand what is developing between these two players without knowing where Bond came from and what he had to survive just to get onto that field. Isaiah Bond was not supposed to be undrafted. That is the starting point for everything that comes after. Coming out of the University of Texas in the 2025 NFL Draft, Bond was a legitimate Day 2 prospect. At 6'1" with elite straight-line speed, exceptional body control, and a college resume that included 2 seasons at Alabama before he transferred to Texas, Bond had the kind of physical profile that makes scouts lean forward in their chairs. He could stretch the field vertically in ways that most receivers in his draft class simply could not. He had production at a premier program, he had the athletic traits. Multiple mock drafts had him going in the 2nd round, others had him early in the 3rd. The consensus was clear. Isaiah Bond was going to be a Day 2 pick with genuine starter potential who would grow into a real NFL threat under the right coaching staff. Then, 3 weeks before the draft, accusations emerged. The details were never fully verified. The charges were ultimately dropped before training camp even started, but none of that mattered in the weeks between the accusation and the draft, because the moment those reports surfaced, Isaiah Bond's name disappeared from draft boards across the league. Teams that had him rated in the second round removed him entirely. Private workouts were canceled. Phone calls stopped. The machinery of the NFL draft, which had been preparing to reward Bond for everything he had built over 4 years of college football, ground to a complete halt. And as round 2 came and went without his name being called, as round 3 passed in silence, as round 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 all went by without a single team selecting him, Isaiah Bond sat through one of the most humiliating experiences a college football player can endure. The gut punch of watching the professional football world tell you in real time, in front of your family and your friends and your coaches, that you are not worth what you believed you were worth. The charges were dropped, but undrafted is undrafted, and no one gives that back. What happened after the draft is where Bond's story gets even more complicated, because it wasn't just the slide that he had to overcome. After going undrafted and signing with the Cleveland Browns as an undrafted free agent, Bond missed the entirety of training camp while the legal proceedings were still being resolved. He did not get the summer that every other rookie gets. He did not build the chemistry with his quarterback and his teammates through weeks of two-a-days and walkthrough sessions and film room hours and the thousands of small, invisible repetitions that turn a group of strangers into a functional NFL offense. He arrived in Cleveland in the middle of training camp, after everyone else had already established their roles, already learned the playbook, already developed the shorthand communication that makes an offense function at full speed, and he had to absorb an entirely new professional system from scratch, alone, without the runway that every other player on the roster had already used. And then he went out and produced anyway. In 2025, Isaiah Bond caught 18 passes for 338 yards over 16 games. On the surface, those numbers look modest. They look like exactly what you would expect from an undrafted rookie on a receiver corps that ESPN ranked dead last in the entire league, throwing to quarterback play that was historically poor for most of the season. But the number that matters, the number that tells the real story of what Isaiah Bond is capable of, is 18.8. That is his yards per reception average from his rookie season. 18.8 yards every single time he touched the football. In a league where the average reception gains somewhere between 10 and 12 yards, Bond was generating almost 19 yards per catch on an offense that was, by nearly every measurable standard, one of the worst passing attacks in the NFL. He was not a volume receiver. He was not getting fed targets every week. What he was, and what he remains, is an enormous play machine. A receiver who takes a football and turns it into something significant every time it finds his hands. But none of those numbers, none of that context, none of that backstory captures what happened on November 23, 2025, because November 23rd is when everything changed. Week 22 of the 2025 NFL season. Cleveland Browns versus Las Vegas Raiders. Shedeur Sanders' first career NFL start. The entire country was watching to see if a fifth-round pick, who had been handed the most scrutinized quarterback competition in recent memory, could handle the pressure of stepping onto an NFL field as the starter for a franchise that had been searching for its answer at the position for decades. The moment was enormous. The stakes were real. And in the middle of all of that noise, in the middle of Shedeur processing his first ever NFL start from snap one, he looked to his right, saw Isaiah Bond running a deep route down the sideline with a corner trailing behind him, and threw a football that traveled 52 yards through the air before it settled into Bond's hands for the longest reception of either player's young NFL career. 52 yards on Shedeur Sanders' first NFL start, on a throw that looked like it had been run 1,000 times in practice, because in a very real sense, it had been. Here is what the national media mostly missed when they covered that play, when they clipped it and posted it and moved on to the next story. Isaiah Bond and Shedeur Sanders did not meet in Berea. They did not become familiar with each other in an NFL facility. Their connection reaches back further than that. through shared football circles, through mutual respect built watching each other compete in elite college programs, through a pre-existing foundation that most wide receiver and quarterback duos thrown together in the same draft class simply do not have. Before Bond arrived at Texas, he spent 2 seasons at Alabama. Before Bond arrived in Cleveland, Shedeur Sanders, Coach Prime, Shedeur's father, had attempted to recruit Bond to play at Colorado. These players were not strangers. They had seen each other compete. They had been in the same football world long before they were wearing the same uniform. And when they finally did share a huddle, when Bond finally did run routes with Shedeur throwing him the football, the process of building chemistry that normally takes an entire NFL season to develop was accelerated dramatically by everything that had already been established before either of them took a professional snap. The 52-yard connection against Las Vegas was not luck. It was not a coverage breakdown. It was 2 players who already spoke the same football language finally getting the opportunity to demonstrate it on the biggest possible stage. The offseason that followed told you everything you need to know about how seriously Isaiah Bond is taking the opportunity in front of him. Because Bond did not show up to minicamp as the same player who caught those 18 passes in 2025. He arrived as someone who had spent the entire offseason rebuilding his body with a specific purpose in mind. At the NFL Draft Combine, Isaiah Bond weighed 180 pounds. Going into the 2026 season, his listed weight is 195 pounds. 15 pounds of functional muscle added in a single offseason. In the NFL, that number is not cosmetic. That is not a player who spent the winter in the weight room for the sake of it. 15 pounds of real muscle is the difference between a wide receiver who gets bumped off his route at the line of scrimmage by a physical corner and one who wins his release on every single play. It is the difference between a player who gets out-muscled at the catch point when a safety arrives to contest the ball and one who can fight through contact, absorb the hint, and come down with the reception anyway. At Bond's speed, with his route running ability and his body control already at an elite level, adding that kind of functional strength does not slow him down. It makes him impossible to cover with a single defender, and it makes every deep ball thrown his way a genuine 50-50 jump ball that Bond is now equipped to win. Bond also changed his number. Out went the number he wore as a rookie, and in came 0. In the NFL, players who wear 0 are making a statement. 0 is a number associated with players who want to be noticed, who want to stand out, who are announcing to the league that something has changed. For Isaiah Bond, the message was straightforward: a fresh start, a new identity. No longer the undrafted afterthought who arrived in the middle of camp with charges hanging over him and a playbook he had never seen. Number 0 is a receiver who showed up to minicamp 15 pounds heavier, running cleaner routes and connecting with his quarterback on throws that stopped practice cold. When Bond spoke to the Cleveland Browns team website about his goals for 2026, he was clear about where he sees himself fitting into this offense. He talked about stretching the field vertically. He talked about the deep threat role. He talked about the things he does well and how he intends to do them better. And then at minicamp, he went out and demonstrated exactly that on a 60-yard strike from Shedeur Sanders that every reporter in that building agreed was the most impressive throw of the entire 3-day session. The reporters in attendance called it the throw of the day. Not one of the throws of the day, not a highlight among highlights, the throw of the day, singular. The most memorable moment from 3 full days of mandatory minicamp, a session that also included all the other quarterbacks on the roster, throwing to all the other receivers on the roster in every conceivable drill and situation. Out of everything that happened across those 3 days, the moment that stuck with the people who were actually there was a 60-yard deep ball from Shedeur Sanders to Isaiah Bond. Monken was asked about it directly after practice. What the head coach of the Cleveland Browns said about Isaiah Bond in that moment is worth paying attention to, because Monken is not a coach who hands out easy compliments. He said Bond has really come along early, getting his feet underneath himself and learning the offense, but that Bond has put himself in position to make plays down the field. He acknowledged that everyone knows about Bond's speed, and then he said the thing that every analyst and scout covering this team needs to write down and remember. He said, "What is undervalued about Isaiah Bond is his balance and body control, that he gets in and out of his breaks while maintaining his speed, that it has been fun to watch, that Bond is going to continue to take steps with the way he practices." Undervalued. That word follows Isaiah Bond everywhere, and it has followed him through every stage of his career. Undervalued coming out of college when the accusations tanked his draft stock, undervalued on a receiver core that finished last in the league, undervalued in the national conversation about Cleveland's wide receiver room, where most of the discussion centers on Casey Conapian, the first-round pick, and Denzel Boston, the second-round pick, while Bond quietly produces the most efficient per-target numbers on the entire roster. And now, Monken, the head coach of the franchise, is standing in front of reporters and using the exact same word, undervalued, as if even the people inside the building are still catching up to what this receiver actually is. And then Shedeur went further than his head coach. What Shedeur Sanders said publicly about Isaiah Bond before the 2026 season is the kind of statement that changes how a receiver is used, how he is covered, and how his entire NFL career trajectory develops. When asked about the receiver core heading into the season, Shedeur told reporters clearly and without hesitation he enjoys playing with Isaiah Bond, and he wants to use Bond more in the deep game, which Bond has shown is a major strength of his. He said he wants to use Bond more, full stop. Take a moment to understand what that means in the context of an NFL locker room. Quarterbacks in this league are trained from the moment they enter a professional facility to be politically neutral when discussing their skill players. They talk about how everybody is getting better. They say opportunities will be there for everyone. They credit the whole room. It is a learned behavior, a professional habit that protects team chemistry and prevents the perception that the quarterback is playing favorites. Shedeur Sanders threw all of that out the window. He identified one receiver by name. He said that receiver's specific strength. He expressed a specific desire to utilize that strength more. In doing so, he told every defensive coordinator in the NFL exactly where he intends to attack them, exactly which receiver he trusts in the deepest, most high-stakes situations, and exactly what this offense intends to build around as Shedeur Sanders continues to develop as an NFL starter. That is not just a compliment. That is a declaration. Now, let's put all of this together and talk about what the 2026 Cleveland Browns offense actually looks like for defensive coordinators trying to scheme against it, because this is where the story stops being just interesting and starts being genuinely alarming for everyone outside of Berea. What Shedeur Sanders had around him in 2025 was by nearly every analytical measure one of the worst offensive supporting casts in the league. The receiver room was ranked dead last, the run game was inconsistent, the tight end production was minimal, the quarterback himself was learning an NFL system without the benefit of a full training camp. By the time November arrived, the offense was starting to function, but the infrastructure was not yet in place to make it genuinely dangerous on a week-to-week basis. The 2026 version of this offense is a completely different organism. Start with Harold Landry Jr. at tight end, who produced the best rookie tight end season in the Cleveland Browns history last year, with 72 receptions, 731 yards, and 6 touchdowns. That is not a complimentary piece. That is a number one option who demands a linebacker or a safety's full attention on every single snap he is on the field. When a tight end of that caliber is running seam routes and intermediate crossers, defensive coordinators have to account for him with a dedicated defender on every play, which means someone else on that field is getting a favorable matchup. Add Casey Campion, a first-round pick out of USC, whose route-running ability at the intermediate level is as clean as anyone in this receiver class. Campion does not just run routes, he creates separation on routes that should not create separation, which means defensive coordinators cannot simply assign a corner to him and move on. He requires attention, he requires scheme, and he requires safety help if a defense does not want him carving up the middle of the field on third downs all season. Add Denzel Boston, a second-round pick with real physical tools in the bloodlines to match, who is a genuine threat to win one-on-one matchups on the outside and at the catch point. Boston gives this offense a physical presence in contested situations that it simply did not have last year. Add Dylan Sampson and Quinshon Judkins in the backfield, two running backs who present completely different problems for a defense to solve. When either of those two is on the field, a defense has to commit resources to stopping the run game, which opens up the intermediate routes. When they drop into protection or release into the flat, they become check-down options that force linebackers to stay in their zones rather than cheating toward the line of scrimmage. And then, behind all of that, behind the tight end that demands a safety, behind the receivers that demand corners and scheme, behind the running backs that demand linebacker discipline, there is Isaiah Bond, running deep, waiting. At 195 pounds with elite top-end speed and the body control that Monken himself called undervalued, there is no clean answer for this offense on a defensive alignment chart. Think about the choices a defensive coordinator has to make before every single snap against the Cleveland Browns this season. If you load the box to stop Judkins and Sampson, Shedeur is throwing intermediate routes to Campion, Judy, and Landry Jr. all day long, and you will never get off the field on third down. If you bring a safety down to help with Campion and take away the intermediate game, Bond has single coverage on the outside, and Shedeur is already starting his windup the moment he identifies the coverage. If you play high coverage to eliminate Bond's deep threat entirely, the intermediate routes open up completely. Landry Jr.'s seam routes become automatic first downs, and you are bleeding 4, 5, and 6 yards per play until the fourth quarter when Shedeur puts the game away. There is no simple answer. There is no alignment that neutralizes all of these threats simultaneously. And the player who makes that true, the player who forces a defensive coordinator to make an impossible choice between helping over the top or staying at home, is Isaiah Bond. The deep ball to Bond is the kill shot. It is the threat that makes every other piece of this offense more dangerous, because every defensive coordinator in the league knows it is coming. Shedeur told them it was coming. He said it publicly, on the record with reporters writing it down. He wants to use Bond more in the deep game, and the only way to take away the deep game is to sacrifice something else, and every something else in this offense is a legitimate NFL threat that will punish you for the sacrifice. There is one more dimension to this story that is not getting nearly enough attention, and it might be the most important piece of everything discussed here. Shedeur Sanders and Isaiah Bond are in their second year. Everything that has been described in this video, the chemistry, the connection, the 60-yard throw of the day, the 18.8 yards per reception average, the public endorsement, the 15 pounds of muscle, all of it has been built between two players who are still at the very beginning of what they are capable of together. Consider the circumstances of their first year. Bond missed training camp entirely. He arrived in the middle of a camp he had no context for, learning a playbook from scratch while his teammates were already weeks ahead of him in their development. Shedeur made his first career NFL start in Week 12 against the Ravens without a single first-team practice rep leading into the game. The entire 2025 season for both of these players was spent catching up, learning, surviving, producing despite circumstances that would have derailed less resilient players entirely. Now imagine what they look like with a full training camp, with first-team reps from day one, with the muscle and the experience and the developed chemistry already in place before a single regular season snap is taken. Imagine what a 60-yard deep ball looks like, not in June minicamp, but on a clear September afternoon in a stadium full of people, with a defensive coordinator on the opposite sideline realizing in real time that he did not account for this, that he focused too much on Campion, that he let Bond release clean off the line, that he did not get his safety over the top in time. The Cleveland Browns official broadcast team already has a name for what happens when these two connect on a deep ball. They call it launch codes, as in Shedeur Sanders receives launch codes for a 52-yard gain. That is not a nickname a broadcast team invents for a play that happened once by accident. That is a nickname born from something that looks automatic every single time it develops, something so precise and so well executed that it requires the kind of dramatic language you use when you watch something that does not look like it should be possible from an undrafted rookie and a fifth-round quarterback in their first professional season together. Launch codes. Starting July 28th, the entire NFL gets to see what Year 2 of launch codes looks like with a full training camp behind it. Here is where everything lands heading into the 2026 season. Isaiah Bond arrived in Berea as an afterthought. He arrived with accusations that were ultimately dropped, with no training camp, with no runway, with a playbook he had never seen, and a receiver room that finished last in the entire league. He averaged 18.8 yards per reception on an offense that could barely complete a pass. He built a connection with a quarterback through shared football history, through a 52-yard bomb on the biggest stage of both their lives, and through an offseason spent adding 15 pounds of muscle and developing the kind of rapport that defensive coordinators pay their analysts overtime to find answers for. He changed his number. He showed up to minicamp and produced the throw of the day. He earned a public endorsement from his quarterback that quarterbacks in this league simply do not give. He earned a description from his head coach that included the word undervalued, which at this point in his career feels less like a criticism of how others see him and more like a warning to every team scheduled to face the Browns in 2026. Shedeur Sanders is not a fifth-round mystery anymore. He is the quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, surrounded by the most complete offensive cast he has ever had in a professional setting, throwing deep balls to a receiver who was built for exactly this role and who has spent an entire year learning how to be the player that this offense needs him to be. The NFL had every opportunity to take this connection seriously before it became a problem. The draft ignored Bond, the national media ignored the November connection, the analysts focused on Compiègne and Boston and Landry Jr., and missed the player averaging nearly 19 yards per catch, running routes behind all of them. Defensive coordinators spent the offseason scheming for the first-round pick and the second-round pick and the historic tight end, which is exactly what Shedeur Sanders is counting on them to do. On July 28th, training camp opens in Berea, and on that day, Shedeur Sanders and Isaiah Bond will walk onto a practice field as the most underrated deep ball connection in professional football, with a full offseason behind them, with an offensive roster that makes defending this pairing an exercise in managing impossible trade-offs, and with a head coach who stopped practice to acknowledge what they are capable of together. What happens between July 28th and the first Sunday of the regular season is going to determine exactly how much of a problem this connection becomes for the rest of the AFC.
But based on what was seen on June 9th in Berea, based on the 60 yards of precision that stopped practice cold, based on 15 pounds of muscle and a number change, and a quarterback who told the entire league where he intends to attack them, the answer is already taking shape. The NFL is not prepared for this, and by the time they figure out how to stop it, Shedeur and Bond will already be a problem that cannot be corrected mid-season. Number 0 is just getting started, and number 2 already knows exactly where to find him. Leave a comment below. Do you believe Shedeur Sanders and Isaiah Bond are going to be the most dangerous deep ball connection in the AFC by the end of 2026 season? All perspectives are welcome. Training camp opens July 28th. That is when the real conversation begins. This script is produced for informational and entertainment purposes. All statistics, quotes, and reports referenced are drawn from verified, publicly available sports journalism published between August 2025 and June 2026. Sources include the Cleveland Browns official website, Pro Football Reference, Heavy.com, BrownsNation.com, Browns Film Breakdown, and StadiumRant.com. This channel is not affiliated or representative of Shedeur Sanders, Isaiah Bond, the Cleveland Browns, the NFL, or any other person or organization mentioned. All roster and depth chart information is subject to change during training camp and the preseason.